The restaurant was the kind of place where silence cost money. Madeline Cross sat across from Jordan Pierce, a man she had known for exactly 22 minutes, and said it the way she said everything, clean, final, without apology. I can't love a single dad. She expected irritation, or the usual scramble to impress her. Jordan gave her neither. He set down his glass, reached into his jacket, and placed a sealed envelope beside her water glass. Then he paid the bill, the entire bill, including hers, and walked out. Inside the envelope was something she wasn't prepared for. The blind date had been Claire's idea. Claire, who had known Madeline Cross since college, who understood exactly how Madeline operated, and still somehow believed that a single dinner could soften 17 years of carefully constructed walls. She had texted Madeline 2 days before, just one dinner. No pressure, he's different. Madeline had almost said no. She had a board call at 7, a term sheet to review before midnight, and absolutely no interest in spending an evening performing warmth for a stranger. But Claire had used the word different, and Madeline Cross, despite everything, was still curious enough to show up. The restaurant was called Linden. It sat on the 43rd floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan, the kind of place where the menu had no prices, and the lighting was engineered to make everyone look like they had something to hide. Madeline arrived 4 minutes early, which for her was late. She had worn a black dress she'd bought in Milan 2 years ago, not because she was trying, but because it was the first thing her hand touched in the closet, and she refused to rethink it. She was seated, handed a water glass she didn't ask for, and told her guest had already arrived. Jordan Pierce was already at the table. He stood when she approached, not in the performative way some men did, the kind designed to signal breeding, but simply as if standing were the natural response to someone entering a room. He was lean, unhurried, wearing a dark navy jacket over a white shirt with no tie. He had the kind of face that didn't announce itself. Nothing sharp, nothing soft, just steady. Madeline sat down, scanned him the way she scanned a term sheet, quickly looking for the clause that would cause problems, and found nothing immediately disqualifying. That in itself was unusual. They talked the way strangers at expensive restaurants talk careful surface-level orbiting topics without landing. He asked about her work without the awe she usually got from men who'd Googled her beforehand. She asked about his strategic consulting independent long-term clients, and he answered without the practiced humility that often masked ego. The conversation had a rhythm to it that surprised her. Not exciting, not thrilling, just clean. Like a negotiation between two people who'd both done this long enough to know the difference between real and performed. It was when Claire's name came up again, her mutual friend, the one who had orchestrated the whole evening, that the conversation shifted. Claire had apparently told Jordan almost nothing about Madeline beyond her name and her general industry. Madeline found that either admirably restrained or vaguely insulting, she hadn't decided which. She asked Jordan what he did know going into the evening. He said only that Claire had described her as someone worth taking seriously. Madeline filed that away. Then the conversation turned the way conversations at dinners like this always eventually do toward the question of what each person's life actually looked like outside of work. Jordan mentioned it the same way he mentioned everything else, without decoration, without a setup designed to manage her reaction. He had a daughter. He was raising her alone. It had been that way for 4 years, and he had no particular interest in framing it as either a burden or a badge. He said it, and moved on, reaching for his glass with the ease of someone who had made peace with a fact long before he was asked to explain it. Madeline heard it land, and she felt very precisely the mechanism inside her shift. She had a rule about this, not a formal rule, not something she had ever written down or said out loud, but a rule nonetheless. Men with complicated lives brought complicated lives into everything they touched. And Madeline Cross had spent the better part of a decade building something clean, a company, a reputation, a structure in which every variable was either controlled or eliminated. She had been burned before, not by anyone she'd loved, but by people she had trusted partners who had used proximity to her to extract what they needed, then quietly disappeared. After the second time, she stopped allowing proximity to become a liability. So when she set her glass down and said, "I can't love a single dad," she meant it the way she meant every policy decision, not cruel, not personal, just efficient. It was a filter. It was information. It was the kind of clarity she wished more people offered her, instead of wasting her time across 6 months of slow disappointment. She said it and expected him to respond, the way men in his position usually responded, with a defense of himself, a pivot, a careful repositioning of the facts. Jordan did none of those things. He looked at her for a moment, and there was nothing in his expression that resembled hurt. What she saw instead was something closer to recognition, the look of a person who has just confirmed a suspicion they had been hoping was wrong. His voice when he spoke was even. "Is that because you can't handle someone else's history?" he said. "Or because you've never had to make room for anyone who didn't need something from you?" Madeline opened her mouth and found for the first time in longer than she could remember that the immediate response she expected to have was not there. The words had not formed yet. Jordan did not fill the silence for her. He set his napkin on the table with a kind of finality that was not dramatic. It was simply definitive. He caught the attention of a waiter without flagging her down, and when the bill came, he handled it entirely. No conversation about splitting it, no gesture toward her. He paid for everything, including the 2 glasses of wine Madeline had ordered before he arrived, which she knew because she had ordered them early, and they were listed separately. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a sealed white envelope beside her water glass. It was unmarked on the outside, no name, no label. He slid it toward her with 2 fingers, not as a gift and not as a threat, but with the calm of someone completing an errand they had planned in advance. "Read it when you actually want to understand what you just said." That was it. No raised voice, no pointed exit. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked toward the door at the same pace he had walked through every other moment of the evening, like a man who had already decided where he was going long before anyone else in the room had caught up. Madeline did not call after him. She sat very still and watched him leave, and the restaurant continued around her glasses, clinking low voices, the hum of a room full of people performing their own version of important. And she felt something she could not immediately name. Not embarrassment, not anger exactly. Something closer to the sensation of reaching for a door handle and finding the door was already open. She had expected resistance. She had expected him to want something from her. The fact that he had wanted nothing, had in fact left, before she could give or withhold anything at all, was not a feeling she had a file for. The envelope sat beside her water glass. White, sealed, ordinary. She did not open it at the table. She picked it up, put it in her bag, and signaled for the check, then remembered with a stillness that felt almost like embarrassment that the check had already been paid. She sat for another 4 minutes alone, in the kind of restaurant where silence cost money. Then she left. She opened the envelope at 11:47 at night, sitting at the kitchen island in her apartment with a glass of water she hadn't touched and her coat still on. She had told herself she would wait until morning, until she was rested and clear-headed and not still carrying the residue of the evening. She lasted 40 minutes. Inside was a single folded page, no letterhead, no signature. Just a dense, precise breakdown. Numbers sourcing notes, projected figures laid out in the clean, unadorned format of someone who had spent years communicating with people who did not have time for narrative. It took her less than 2 minutes to understand what she was reading. It took her considerably longer to accept it. The document was an ethical risk analysis of the Hartwell acquisition, a deal Madeline's company had been quietly assembling for the better part of 8 months. The Hartwell Group was a mid-sized logistics firm in the Midwest, financially distressed, asset-rich, and positioned in a way that made it attractive to 3 different buyers. Madeline's firm had moved, carefully structured the approach to minimize noise, and was weeks away from closing. The analysis in her hand, laid out methodically, and without drama, what the acquisition would actually require: consolidation of 4 regional offices, elimination of approximately 340 positions in the first fiscal year, and a restructuring timetable designed to deliver returns to her investors within 24 months. None of that was secret. Her team knew it. Her board knew it. She knew it. What the document also contained, and what her own team had not put into any formal file, was a projection of the downstream effects on 2 of those regional communities, both in smaller cities, where the Hartwell offices were among the largest private employers. The numbers were not speculative. They were sourced. The analysis cited municipal tax revenue data, regional unemployment figures, and a comparison with 2 similar acquisitions from the previous decade, where the acquiring firm had followed the same consolidation model. The outcomes in both cases had taken years for those communities to partially recover from. At the bottom of the page, in the same even font as the rest of the document, was one line. "You're about to lay off hundreds of people just to win a game." Madeline read it twice. Then she set the page face down on the counter, walked to the window, and stood there for a while looking at the city. She was not a person who made decisions carelessly. She had reviewed the Hartwell acquisition from every angle her team had presented. What angered her, and she recognized it as anger, because it had the particular heat of something that had gotten past her defenses, was not the accusation. It was the accuracy. Jordan Pierce had looked at her across a dinner table for less than an hour and had handed her a document that cut closer to the center of the deal than anything her own advisors had produced. She called her head of research the next morning at 7:15. She asked 3 questions, received 3 answers she did not like, and ended the call. Then she asked her assistant to pull everything publicly available on Jordan Pierce filings, partnerships, advisory history, any affiliated funds. Her assistant sent the first batch within 90 minutes. Madeline read it at her desk with her door closed. What she found rewired the entire picture. Jordan Pierce was not simply an independent consultant with a tidy client list. For the past 6 years, he had been the operational mind behind a private capital fund called Meridian Slate, a fund that had no public profile, no press presence, and no LinkedIn page, but which had quietly taken minority positions in 14 companies across logistics, healthcare infrastructure, and regional manufacturing. Meridian Slate was known in the specific circles where it mattered. For one consistent behavior, it did not participate in deals that required significant workforce reductions as the primary mechanism of value creation. It had walked away from 3 transactions in the past 2 years that would have returned substantial gains, specifically because the path to those gains ran through mass layoffs. The fund's returns were still strong. Its reputation among the people who knew it existed was immaculate. And Meridian Slate was one of 2 capital sources her CFO had flagged 6 weeks ago as a potential anchor investor for the Hartwell Close. The internal note had described the fund as selective but worth pursuing. Madeline had approved the outreach and then let it sit in her pipeline without following up personally because she had other things to move. She now understood with a clarity that was genuinely unpleasant that Jordan Pierce had come to dinner already knowing exactly who she was and what she was building, and had sat across from her with perfect composure, while she had dismissed him inside of 22 minutes. She called Claire that afternoon. The call lasted less than 4 minutes. Claire said she had not told Jordan anything about the Hartwell deal, had not known about it herself, and that she had arranged the dinner because she thought 2 intelligent people might find each other interesting. Madeline believed her. The research Jordan had compiled had not come from Claire. It had come from someone who did his homework before he walked into any room, professional or personal. Madeline drafted a message to Jordan that evening. She deleted the first version because it read like a press release. She deleted the second because it was an apology that somehow became a pitch halfway through. The third version was the one she sent direct brief, acknowledging that she had underestimated him and asking if he would be willing to meet again. She suggested a restaurant. She mentioned almost as an afterthought that she had a proposal she thought might interest him. Jordan replied the following morning. He said he was available Thursday at noon and proposed a different location, a quiet, unremarkable cafe near his office, the kind of place that had nothing to recommend it except good coffee and no one to overhear a conversation. Madeline agreed and spent the 2 days before the meeting preparing. She had her team put together a formal partnership deck. She ordered a bottle of wine from a producer she knew he'd referenced in a profile from 4 years ago, obscure enough that finding it had required effort, visible enough that he would recognize the gesture. She arrived at the cafe carrying the wine in a bag and a folder of materials under her arm, which in retrospect she understood was the problem. Jordan was already there when she arrived, both hands around a coffee cup, no laptop, no documents. He looked at the bottle she set on the table and at the folder, and something shifted in his expression. Not warmth draining away, but something more like a door that had been slightly open returning to its frame. Madeline launched into it anyway. The partnership structure, the revised approach to Hartwell, the ways Meridian Slate's participation could reshape the optics and the outcome. She laid it out cleanly. It was a good pitch. She knew it was a good pitch because she had delivered it to herself 3 times in the mirror of her hotel bathroom the morning before. When she finished, Jordan looked at her for a moment. Then he pushed the wine bottle gently back toward her side of the table. "I appreciate the research," he said, with a tone that carried no sarcasm and no warmth. "But I don't need a bottle of wine to take a meeting seriously, and I don't need a deck to have a conversation." Madeline started to respond, and he continued. "You came here with materials. That's fine. But you also came here with a gift designed to show me you know things about me, and that's a different thing. I'm not a stakeholder you're managing. If that's the framework you're working in, this is going to be the same conversation we already had." Madeline put her hand flat on the folder and did not open it. The cafe was quiet around them. She said, "I read the analysis." Jordan said he knew. She asked how he had gotten the data on Hartwell, and he said some of it was public record. Some of it was pattern recognition, and most of it was simply the result of paying attention to how certain kinds of deals were structured. He said it the way someone says, something that is true without needing to be impressive about it. Madeline found it harder to hold her position than she expected. She was accustomed to being the most prepared person in any room. Jordan Pierce had managed to be more prepared by bringing nothing. The meeting ended without a deal and without resolution. Jordan said he would think about the Hartwell situation and that his thinking would not be shaped by a partnership offer, but by what she actually decided to do with the acquisition. He said it without ultimatum, just information. Madeline walked back to her car and sat in it for 6 minutes without starting the engine, which was 4 minutes longer than she had ever sat still without a reason. The board met the following week. The message from her 2 largest institutional investors was unambiguous close Hartwell on the original terms, or explain to them in writing why $340 million in projected returns was being left on the table. The room had 12 people in it, and 11 of them were aligned. Madeline looked at the numbers on the screen, her numbers, her model, her deal, and felt the pull of every decision she had ever made that had gotten her to this table. She had built something real. She had done it by being the person who did not flinch when the math was hard. She told the board she needed 72 hours to confirm the final structure, and they gave it to her because she had never asked for time without using it well. She used 48 of those hours trying to find a version of the deal that worked differently. She called her CFO her restructuring advisor and 2 outside consultants who had no stake in the outcome. None of them could make the numbers work without the consolidation. On the 49th hour, she authorized the original term sheet. She told herself she would revisit the workforce question in the integration phase, that there were always ways to soften the landing once the deal was closed, that the responsible thing was to get it done first. She signed the authorization and sent it. 14 hours later, Meridian Slate formally withdrew its expression of interest in any future collaboration with Cross Capital Group. There was no press release. Jordan did not operate that way, but within 48 hours, the second anchor investor, who had been watching Meridian Slate's position as a signal, followed. Without both sources of capital, the Hartwell close required a debt structure that triggered a covenant review from Madeline's primary lending relationship. The story broke in a financial trade publication on a Wednesday morning. Cross Capital's Hartwell play stalls as key backers exit. By Thursday, 2 general business outlets had picked it up with framing that was considerably less clinical. The headline in one of them read, "Billionaire CEO loses major deal amid ethics questions." Madeline read it at her desk alone, door closed. She did not call anyone. She sat with it the way the document in the envelope had asked her to sit with something weeks ago in her kitchen at 11:47 at night, with her coat still on. She understood now what Jordan had done when he walked out of Linden. He had not punished her. He had not positioned himself. He had simply refused to participate in a version of events where being dismissed without cause was acceptable, and had trusted that she would eventually understand why. She had taken almost a month to get there. The city outside her office window looked exactly the same as it always had. She felt for the first time in a very long time like she did not entirely know what she was doing. The Hartwell deal did not die quietly. Deals like that never did. Over the following 2 weeks, Madeline's communications team managed what they could: a carefully worded statement about strategic reassessment, a background briefing with 2 friendly journalists, a redirect toward other portfolio activity that was performing well. None of it fully contained the story, because the story was not really about Hartwell. It was about the gap between the version of Madeline Cross that appeared in profiles and the version that had signed an authorization knowing what it would cost 340 people she had never met. That gap was not new. What was new was that she could no longer look past it. She did something she had never done in the middle of a business crisis. She slowed down. Not visibly, her calendar stayed full. Her team saw no change in pace, but internally she stopped moving forward on the Hartwell integration, while she still technically held the deal. She told her restructuring advisor she needed a full audit of alternatives before any workforce action was initiated. Her advisor looked at her with the carefully neutral expression of someone who had learned not to question her directly, and said he would have it within 10 days. Madeline said she needed it in 6. He had it in 5. The audit did not produce a miracle. There was no version of Hartwell that returned the same numbers without consolidation. But there were 2 versions that preserved more than 200 of the 340 positions versions that required longer timelines, thinner margins in the first 3 years, and a different conversation with her institutional investors than the one she had already had. Madeline read both versions on a Sunday morning with no one else in the office. She read them the way she had read the document from the envelope, slowly, without looking for the exit. She called an emergency board session for the following Tuesday and walked in with the alternative models. The room had the same 12 people it always had. She did not ease into it. She told them she had reviewed the deal structure and concluded that the original terms were not ones she was willing to execute. She presented both alternatives, acknowledged the margin differential clearly and without softening it, and told them she was recommending the second model, the one that preserved the most jobs while still delivering a viable return over a longer horizon. One of the institutional investors asked if she understood what she was walking away from. Madeline said she understood exactly what she was walking away from, and that understanding it was the point. The vote was not unanimous. It did not need to be. She had enough. The revised Hartwell terms were filed 3 weeks after the original authorization. The trade publication that had run the initial story ran a follow-up cross-capital revises Hartwell structure, retains majority of workforce. The tone was measured slightly surprised. Two of the journalists who had covered the original story reached out for comment. Madeline's communications team drafted a statement. Madeline rewrote it herself and removed every sentence that sounded like it was designed to rehabilitate her image. What remained was 8 lines about the value of taking time to make decisions correctly. It was not a press strategy. It was just what she actually thought. It was Claire who mentioned the event. She texted Madeline on a Thursday afternoon, almost as an aside. She was volunteering at a regional workforce development initiative the following Saturday, a quarterly thing that connected displaced workers with retraining resources and local employers, and she thought Madeline might want to come. Not as a speaker, not as a donor, just to see how it worked. Madeline's first instinct was to decline. She was not a person who showed up to things in an unofficial capacity. She did not have an unofficial capacity. But she had been making different decisions lately, and the decision to show up felt like a continuation of that. So she said, yes. The event was held in a converted warehouse space on the north side of the city, high ceilings, folding tables. The particular organized chaos of a room where volunteers were running 6 simultaneous activities, and everyone knew their role except the people who had just arrived. Madeline wore clothes she could move in and left her phone in her bag. Claire met her at the entrance and walked her through the space, and Madeline listened more than she spoke, which was itself unusual. She saw Jordan 40 minutes after she arrived. He was at a table near the back of the room sitting across from a man who had the posture of someone who had been through something hard and was not sure yet what came next. Jordan was not delivering a pitch or a program. He was just talking, steady, unhurried, his hands loose on the table, his attention entirely on the person in front of him. Whatever he was saying, it was not scripted. Madeline watched from across the room and understood with a clarity that had nothing to do with business that Jordan Pierce had not come to this event to be seen. He had come because this was simply where he put his time. She did not approach him immediately. She spent another hour helping Claire at a registration table, sorting folders, answering questions from attendees that she answered as straightforwardly as she could, without reaching for authority she hadn't earned in this room. At some point, she looked up, and Jordan was standing a few feet away, watching her, with the same expression she'd seen at the dinner table. Not quite surprised, not surprised. He said, "Claire brought you." It was not a question. Madeline said yes. He nodded, as if that was enough information for the moment, and returned to what he was doing. They ended up in the same corner of the room near the end of the afternoon, when the formal activity had wound down and the space was shifting from organized to tired. There were still a dozen people there cleaning up stacking chairs. Jordan was carrying a folding table toward a stack of them against the wall. Madeline picked up the other end, without being asked. They set it down, and Jordan looked at her with something that might have been the beginning of being disarmed, and Madeline said before she had fully decided to, "I stopped the Hartwell consolidation." Jordan said nothing. He turned back toward the remaining tables. Madeline followed. They worked through the rest of the cleanup without making a production of the conversation, which felt appropriate to her in a way she couldn't have explained. When the last table was stacked, Jordan leaned against the wall and crossed his arms and looked at her in the even direct way he had of looking at people like he wasn't managing his reaction, just having it. Madeline looked back at him and said what she had been trying to find the language for since she read the headline in her office with the door closed. "What I said at dinner," she said. "It wasn't a standard. It was an excuse." Jordan kept his eyes on her and let her continue. "I've been telling myself for years that I filter out complications. But I don't filter complications. I filter out anyone who might require me to change something." She had rehearsed none of this. It sounded like it. "You walked out of that restaurant, and I told myself you were being dramatic. And then I spent 3 weeks trying to find a way to respond to what you left me that didn't require me to admit you were right." She stopped there because the next part was harder. "You were right about Hartwell, about the way I was using it to win something, and about what I said. It wasn't about you being a single dad. It was about you being someone who'd already made sacrifices I'd never had to make, and that being a mirror I wasn't ready to look in." Jordan was quiet for long enough that the sounds of the room, a chair being moved, someone calling out a goodbye near the exit filled the space. When he spoke, his voice had the same quality it always had, no performance in it, no distance used as protection. "I know why you said it," he said. "People who've been used learn to reject before they can be rejected. That's not a character flaw. That's a response." He looked at her steadily. "But you wrapped it in a rule. And rules feel cleaner than fear, so they're easier to keep." Madeline did not argue with that. Jordan continued. "You don't need to fall in love with someone's circumstances. You just need to be willing to see the person inside them. That's not an advanced skill. It's just the basic one." Madeline looked at him. "You knew who I was before you walked into Linden." Jordan said yes. She asked why he had agreed to the dinner at all, if he already had a picture of how she operated. He said that a picture was not the same as a conclusion, and that he had spent enough years watching people surprise themselves that he tried not to make final decisions before the information was complete. Madeline said, "And am I surprising you?" Jordan said, "A little." There was something almost careful in the way he said it, not guarded, but exact, like a person measuring a word before using it, not because they were unsure, but because they had learned that precision was a form of respect. There were things she could have said next that would have been easier. She could have pivoted to the business, Meridian Slate, the revised Hartwell terms, the possibility of a working relationship that could be shaped into whatever it needed to be. She could feel the pull of that path, the familiar comfort of converting a personal moment into a transaction where she knew the rules. She did not take it. She said, "I'm sorry. Not for the deal. I'm sorry for that too, and I've tried to correct it, but I'm sorry for the dinner. For what I said and how I said it, and for assuming I already knew what you were before I'd asked you a single real question." She did not follow it with a qualifier or a pivot. She said it, and let it be the end of the sentence. Jordan looked at her for a moment. Then he unfolded his arms and pushed off the wall and said, "I know." Madeline said, "That's it." Jordan said, "What else should there be?" She had an answer forming but recognized it was a business answer, a term, a next step, a framework for what came after the apology, and she let it dissolve. Jordan said, "You fixed the thing you could fix. You said the thing you needed to say without building a case around it. That's more than most people do." He glanced around the now empty room, then back at her. "Are you doing anything after this?" They walked to a coffee shop 2 blocks from the warehouse. Unremarkable, the same energy as the cafe near his office. Nothing to recommend it, except that it was open and quiet. They sat for an hour and 40 minutes. Madeline ordered coffee she actually drank. Jordan ordered tea and finished it. They talked about work in the way that people talk about work, when they are not using it as armor, what it cost, what it gave back, where the line was between ambition and avoidance. Madeline said things she had not said to anyone who worked for her or invested in her, and the strangeness of that, of speaking without calculating the downstream effect of the words, was something she noticed but did not stop. Jordan spoke about his own work, with the same quality she had first noticed at Linden, no performance in it, no version of himself shaped for her approval. He mentioned once briefly that the past 4 years had taught him the difference between being needed and being valued, that the two felt similar from the outside, but produced entirely different results in the person experiencing them. He did not elaborate, and she did not press, but she heard it the way she had heard the document in the envelope, as something that was aimed accurately, and trusted her to do something with it. When they left the coffee shop, the evening had settled into the particular gray-blue of a city in late October, the air carrying the first real edge of cold. They stood on the sidewalk. There was no natural conclusion written for the moment, no deal to close, no document to sign, no outcome that had been negotiated in advance. Madeline found that she did not need one. She said she would like to do this again. Jordan said he would like that too. She asked if they were doing this right, whatever this was, and he said he thought they were just starting, which was different from doing it right and probably more honest. Madeline said that was fair. He said he'd text her. She said, okay. She walked back to her car alone. The city was doing what cities did, moving loud, indifferent to the private calculations of any one person inside it. Madeline walked at a pace that had nothing urgent behind it, her hands in her pockets, and thought about the word Jordan had used starting. She turned it over, the way she turned over numbers looking for the catch, the hidden variable, the term buried in the footnote that would change the red on everything else. She did not find one. Starting was just starting. It meant nothing was decided yet. It meant there was still work to do, and that the work was the point, not the outcome. She had built an entire career on knowing the end before she began, on structuring every move so that the result was as much as possible already determined. She was good at it. She had made it into a kind of identity, not just a method, but a proof of something. What Jordan Pierce had handed her across 2 months and a sealed envelope and a folding table in a warehouse was the possibility that control was not the same thing as clarity, that choosing the outcome in advance was not the same as understanding what you were choosing, and that the most important decisions, the ones about who you let in and what you were willing to build, were exactly the ones that could not be structured in advance without losing the thing that made them matter. Madeline Cross had dismissed a man in under 22 minutes because she had confused a label with a verdict. She had almost destroyed 340 people's livelihoods because she had confused winning with being right. Both of those things had cost her, not in the way that losses usually cost her, not in the clean, quantifiable language of money or market position, but in the slower, less manageable way that personal costs accumulated quietly, without announcing themselves, until you were sitting alone in a 43-floor restaurant with a sealed envelope beside your water glass and no idea what you had just set in motion. She understood now what had been in the envelope, not just the analysis, the invitation to look at herself clearly enough to see what needed to change, delivered without cruelty, without agenda, by a person who had decided he was worth more than the version of him she'd been willing to see. She had taken the long way to understanding it. She had taken the only way she knew. But she was here now, walking through a city she had lived in for 12 years, feeling for the first time in a long time, like the next thing was genuinely open. Not structured, not pre-decided, just open. And she was improbably not afraid of that. She was something closer to ready.